Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you, wherever you are, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our new live webinar today. And I should say also to your TV program, FeedChannel.online. As often as possible, we have the opportunity to address some of your concerns, from the practical issue to its scientific explanation, with experts from all over the world, from science as well as from the industry or end users. And I would say, do not hesitate to propose also topics for our future webinars. Each webinar starts with the introduction on the topic, addressing the fundamental issue with the science, but also the practical issue with some field representatives. And a round table will allow you to ask openly questions during the webinar to our invitees. So I remind you, you have at any time the possibility to ask questions. Do not forget also to visit your FeedChannel.online platform, where you will be able to revisit recent events, such as the Poultry Science Association meeting last July in Orlando, and it will be shortly on the platform with a video on the oxidative stress sessions. You will have also the videos on the EC conference, the Gut Health seminar held in Bangkok last October, the Gut Health International Seminar, and also you will have the possibility to revisit the live webinar on meat quality organized last October, addressing issues on drip loss and meat color stability. And I would say, for those who were disappointed not to be able to ask a question during that webinar, we have worked hard to solve the technical issue. So I hope this time it will work fine. And if you want, and I can say also, if you want to be interviewed or post on the FeedChannel platform, do not hesitate to contact us. It is our fifth FeedChannel live webinar today, and we are pleased to welcome lots of registration people. And I just remind you again that you can post any question at any time on the platform. And if we have no time to answer to all questions, we will answer later on the FeedChannel mailbox. So formulating amino acid beyond building blocks. That's the topic of our live webinar today. Many congress and seminars have addressed issues around the amino acids beyond building blocks. It concerns the beyond the protein deposition, the muscle development or the reproduction. It could be the role of amino acids on immunity, the role of amino acids on gut functioning. It can be the role also of amino acids on appetite and acidity control, or even on the meat quality and carcass quality. So there are a lot of scientific progress, but how to take into account all those progress in the feed formulation? That is a good and important point. And there is also an important aspect today. We are all concerned by the sustainability of the animal protein production, and we want to reduce the nitrogen excretion. And for that, reducing the dietary protein content is a nice possibility to reduce the nitrogen excretion. However, as I said before, to take into account all those recent developments when formulating on dietary amino acids, it's I would say, sometimes it's a big issue, and we will try to discuss today about this issue. And I'm pleased to welcome today around the table two well-known scientists, and we start with Dr. Jaap van Melgen from INRA and AgroCampus West at Rennes in France, as director of the PEGAS Mixed Research Unit, which stands for PEGAS for Physiology, Environment, Genetics, and Animal Breeding. And I think it's important to consider that not only the animal, but we consider also the animal breeding systems. And he has also a lot of expertise on developing models on nutrient metabolism and amino acid metabolism. And Professor Mike Kidd from Arkansas University in USA as an expert on amino acid, and also as director of the Center of Excellence of Poultry Science, and who is well known also on the amino acid recommendations and amino acid knowledge. And I also welcome Lane Vigboldus from Cargill on Skype as representative of the field user and feed formulation sector, because they are at the first line, I would say, to take into account all we will discuss and all we have worked on to for formulation. So Len, can you precise a little bit more your positions within Cargill?
My role in Cargill is that I'm nutrition lead in cargo premix and nutrition in Europe, which means that I'm responsible for all formulation activities across species, as well responsible for all our laboratory activities. And formulation in cargo premix and nutrition doesn't mean just to push on the bottoms and send formulas to a plant, but also to design and yeah, I would say create the best formula which meet expectations of the customer. And the customer can at the end be the farmer, it can be a feed mill, but that's my role in this, to coordinate but also train the team members and taking care that we deliver what our customers expect, what needs to be delivered.
Welcome, Leonard. Thank you. I suggest to first focus on defining what do we mean by amino acid requirements, or maybe I'm sure that Jaap will address that requirements issue, but at least what do we mean by requirements? And I think to start the discussion, I think it's important to ask again, Lane, what represents requirements for the feed formulator? Lane, you have, yeah.
My role in Cargill is that I'm nutrition lead in cargo premix and nutrition in Europe, which means that I'm responsible for all formulation activities across species, as well responsible for all our laboratory activities. And formulation in cargo premix and nutrition doesn't mean.
Yeah, we had a little problem with the Skype, I would say. First, I say, what means requirements for the feed formulator? So the to Len, okay?
Yeah, requirements are always connected to the goal what the customer wants to achieve. So, for example, requirements will be different if a customer is going for daily gain or for feed conversion, or in broiler production, breast meat percentage. So it's always connected to the goal, what the customer, what the final user wants to achieve. And it also is different between feed mills and completely integrated companies, for example, because they are judged on different aspects of it.
It's important to reconsider that the objective of the requirements, but maybe asking Jaap about what do mean requirements of response of the animals to the scientist.
Well, to a scientist, and I think also in practical feed formulation. In practical feed formulation, we express feed values and nutrient requirements. They are based on a system. You formulate based on a net energy system or a metabolizable energy system or a standardized ileal digestible amino acid system. So that's the main point. We have to decide what system are you going to use, because what we want to do is we want to express feed value and animal requirement on the same level. You cannot mix a net energy requirement with a metabolizable energy value. Same thing for amino acids. So it is in fact a compromise between an attribute that you can, a property that you can attribute to a diet or to a feed ingredient, and a property that you can attribute to an animal. And we have to find a compromise doing so. So that's very important. You cannot mix systems. Systems have to be unique and established both on the requirement side and on the value side. And just as an example to illustrate what we can think of in terms of requirement, on the graph you see a response of pigs to the valine to lysine supply in terms of daily gain. And what you see here, the individual dots mean individual animals. And I'll just let the audience think about what, in their view, is the requirement of that animal.
With the variability, it's quite a nice.
With the variability among animals. Now, and if you can, of course, apply statistics to this, and on the next two graphs, next to lines, you see two statistical models that you can apply to the curve, and you see that differ quite extensively in the way they express a requirement. On the red line, it's a classical broken line curve analysis where the requirement would be 68%. And you can see that as soon as you are below that requirement, performance declines. The blue curve is a curvilinear response, and you can see that the requirement is much higher. So are we really interested in requirements, or are we interested in the response to the animal? Because you can see that below 73, 72, how much performance do you lose? So is it requirement or is it a response?
That's an interesting question, and also I'm sure Lane will have some comments on the benefits and economic benefits on that. Mike, maybe on that issue, we talk about the requirements on the objectives, I would say, but what about the model, and what about the issue, the products we want?
Absolutely, and it's been well said by both Lynn and Jaap. The model is an indication statistically to give us an idea where the response is occurring. What we have to rely on are the production functions of interest, what the producer needs to have a spec on, because you only have one number in feed formulation, and that has to be an economic optimum. So I really like the way the conversation is started here today, and that we're really not looking at response or a requirement. We're looking at what response is needed to give us the economic optimum in that, and it varies depending upon if we have the high meat yield versus focusing on feed conversion or calorie conversion. So depending upon the bird, depending upon the economics, we need to take that statistical model and backtrack into feed formulation for a good number.
It's a good point when you show the graph with the different objectives, and so I'm sure that Lane, when we talk about objectives, has a different feeling I would say a practical feeling on how to use the amino acids. So maybe Lane, can you comment a little bit further behind Mike on the objectives and requirements?
So these requirements are never, I would say, static, but they will be adjusted to the needs of the customers, like you mentioned, whole bird production or sales of whole birds versus breast meat. Even in countries where whole birds are produced and sold, people might have the goal to differentiate, to deliver a better carcass than competition is doing. And one aspect of that is breast meat. Then the breast meat percentage is not measured, but still important to achieve a better quality of whole birds by which they can differentiate compared to competition. And therefore it all starts with the discussion with the customer. What do they want to achieve? Where are they judged on? It can be that they are just judged on the 100 kilo price of the feed. Mm-hmm. Then you use other requirements than if they are judged on feed conversion, which is very typical for feed mills who sell feed. But integrators who also own the slaughtering house, the carcass yield or the cost per kilo of production is much more important. Or the output of the slaughtering plant, or so the daily gain might be more important, slaughtering one day earlier, more birds per year, and the better utilization of the slaughtering house.
So, yeah, thanks, Lane. So, talking about requirements, you have the model importance, you have the objectives, and the practical utilizations. I wanted to also address the question to someone else, Elisabeth Baeza from INRA in France, who is in charge of duck nutrition and meat quality, about what is the situation in the duck nutrition regarding amino acid requirements. And I've realized this interview last week at INRA in Tours, so let's listen to what Elisabeth said about amino acids requirement in ducks. So I'm pleased to welcome Elisabeth Baeza from INRA in Tours, who is in charge of waterfowl production and particularly on poultry meat quality issues. And regarding the topic about amino acid formulation beyond building blocks, I'm quite interested by how we consider, in fact, ducks in that perspective of amino acid formulation. And my first question would be, what are the main difference between broiler and duck regarding the amino acid?
Well, the formulation with amino acid for ducks, you must take into account that there are different species and different genotypes of ducks. So to produce meat, of course. So Peking, Muscovy, and the crossbred between these two species, the mule duck. And these different species have different growth rate and different body development. So you will not have the same requirements regarding the different rearing periods, so the growing, the starting, the growing, and the finishing periods. But of course, by now, the requirements for the essential amino acids, so lysine, methionine, tryptophan, and threonine, are well known for these ducks.
For both type of breeds,
Yes.
Peking and Muscovy,
Yes.
and the crossbred.
Yes.
And we currently formulate in digestible amino acid basis, as we say in broiler or layer productions. What about the situation in ducks? And do we know the digestibility difference between ducks and poultry and broiler, I would say?
So until now, the formulation with amino acids, you must take into account the total amino acids for ducks.
Mm-hmm.
You can use the coefficients which have been determined for broiler chickens, but there are various studies who showed that these coefficients are lower for ducks by comparison with the broiler chickens. Well, there is now a recent study, who determined the optimum lysine, digestible lysine level for starting and growing diets, but only for the Peking ducks.
And what about, because there are much longer period of breeding, I would say, in ducks, what about the digestibility for finishing ducks, for instance? Do they catch up much more compared to broiler when they are older?
No. It is always lower. The values are always lower than that which have been determined for chicken.
Typically in animal protein production, we talk about sustainability, and one of the key points is reducing the dietary protein content, so trying to formulate with much lower protein diets. What is the situation regarding duck nutrition?
So the decreasing concentration of protein in diets was tested. Yes, so for Muscovy ducks during the finishing periods, it was shown that it was possible to decrease the protein content from 15 to 12.4%. Of course, by keeping the concentration of essential amino acids according to the requirements of ducks. And recently, we also found a study who showed that during the growing period for Peking ducks, so that means between 14 to 35 days of age, it was also possible to decrease the protein content in the diet from 17% to 50%, 50.4, I think. But also by keeping the amino acid, the
essential one.
Yes, not all the amino acid with the same concentration for the different diets.
What do you think about the formulation, taking into account the additional benefits of amino acid beyond their requirement for growth or reproduction, for instance, like when we talk about sulfur amino acid and antioxidant capacities, or threonine and immune capacity, and so on? How do you think we should take into account these additional benefits, I would say, in amino acid formulation?
The only parameter which was taken into account in these studies on amino acids was the body composition, so mainly the fatness and the meat yield, but the effects of the different levels of amino acids in the diet did not investigate the effects on the meat quality.
Working on ducks, in fact, you work, I would say, in Europe, quite a lot of duck production, but also in China or Asia. And what are the main difference between, I would say, European type of production and the Asian type of production?
By now, I think that in Europe, the breeders have more developed ducks with a high body weight and a high meat yield, because we cut a lot the carcasses, and consumers really want to have quite high meat yield. But when you go to Asia, people use the carcasses, the whole carcasses, to prepare the famous roasted Peking ducks. And they want to have, they do not take so much into account the meat yield. They really want to have a skin with a lot of subcutaneous fat, in order to have a crispy
taste after.
Crispy skin when it is roasted.
So it's quite a big difference on the. And do they consider the amino acid nutrition the same?
Yes, of course. Particularly for the Peking ducks, which are now slaughtered at very early age, between 35, 42 days of age. So in ducks, the problem is that the breast meat is going to develop very late during the development of the whole body development. But for the Asian consumers, what is interesting is to have really this skin and this fat carcasses. So now with the lines they have selected for very high growth rate, they don't take into account so much the breast meat yield as you can have in Europe.
Okay. And last question maybe, and typically for French people, I would say, we talk about the foie gras, fatty liver. What is the requirement when we talk about amino acids and this type of lipid deposition, I would say?
I will say that the period which is quite sensitive is during the restriction phase, just before the preparation to overfeeding phase. So during this restriction period, you have to be careful with the amino acid provided in the diet.
Okay, thank you very much, Elisabeth. So looking at another species, on another objective on the requirements, like the ducks with the composition, carcass composition, fatty liver and so on, is quite interesting. But Mike, maybe after the model, after the objective, the carcass objective and so on, what about the effect on the genotype, effect of age and so on the amino acid requirements?
Sure. We've been looking at valine needs, and we focused on the cob female bird. Before we embarked in some of these studies, the first thing we had to do was look at the literature, and we standardized it somewhat. The table that's presented will show the different valine to lysine responses in male broilers only. Now, we took the liberty to take all of the literature, and some of which did not look at ideal protein concepts. They looked at maximal valine responses. So you have to be careful in how you interpret that, but we expressed everything back to the digestible level, and then we ratioed it to lysine, which could underestimate some of those responses for valine, but it gives you a apples-to-apples comparison of the literature. And there are a few studies that are below and above what we consider, say, in the low 70s to below that to in the upper 70s to the 80s. But for the most part, our experimentation is going to run from low 70s to upper 70s, which gives you a pretty good response curve, as we discussed earlier, to try and pinpoint the valine responses. In some of the past research that we did, the footnotes in the work by Thornton, she did her complete master's thesis on valine needs in a growing broiler, and the first response was down towards a 70, which was statistically the highest response we got, and we got no quadratic responses after that, but only linear. So we have the bottom to the top, and there's some variation there. So particularly with this amino acid, we still have a lot to learn, and we're currently investigating that at the University of Arkansas.
I think it's interesting to look at the amino acid requirement. And Jaap, what about the relationship with the composition of the tissue, the amino acids which are deposited, in fact?
These are basically the building blocks of protein. And when we think about animal protein, we typically think of it's one protein, but there are many proteins, different proteins in the animal. And on the slide, you see the composition of different proteins for the 6 amino acids that we have that are most limiting in most diets. And you can see that, for instance, muscle has a specific composition, but hair and feathers have a completely different composition, especially in terms of lysine, much lower in lysine and very high in cysteine. Endogenous secretions typically are rather low compared to muscle. So they have different compositions. What you also have to take into account that the way these proteins are being built and rebuilt and renewed differs. For instance, protein turnover is very high for mucins and intestinal proteins, where it is much lower in muscle, and of course virtually inexistent in hair. And you lose hair and feathers, but you don't renew them once they are made. So we have to take into account that there's not one animal protein. And even in muscle, if you look at muscle composition, muscle is composed of many proteins. Myosin and actin are the most important one, and you can see that also myosin and actin don't have very different compositions. And there's another protein, collagen, which can be quite important in animal production. It has very low in these 6 amino acids. So the way the animal is depositing amino acids, well, is it depositing muscle with myosin and actin, or is it depositing collagen? And if we have a limiting supply of an amino acid, what protein will he deposit? What will come first? Will the animal make priorities?
It goes back to the objective, in fact, when, depending on the type of muscle you are targeting. Obviously, maybe the myosin-actin ratio is not the same, and maybe the needs of amino acid would be different.
Absolutely. And to go further a little bit on determining requirements, we can determine requirements based on an empirical approach where we look at some response criterion, average daily gain, profit to an amino acid. We can also have a look at amino acid requirements using a factorial approach, where we basically want to decompose all the elements of the requirement. And on the slide you see a decomposition of amino acid requirements based on the diet, and part of it is indigestible, part of it is being accounted for as specific endogenous losses. But if we base our system on the standardized digestible system, we have to account for the fact that the animal has to make basal endogenous amino acids. There's some loss for maintenance, and then there's an available amino acid supply. And even if that available amino acid supply would be 100 units, the animal will never ever deposit 100 units of that amino acid. There's always a maximum efficiency or a minimum catabolism.
And that will differ between amino acids, for instance?
That differs between amino acids because they are used for different functions. They are involved in different turnover, in the turnover of different proteins. And in the next slide, I have an example, a numerical example of the requirement of a given animal, weighing a pig, 50 kilogram pig. And you see some numerical values over there. And for those interested, they can reconstruct the graph that you see on the right-hand side. But you can see that basically, fortunately, the deposition is the largest part of the requirement. But there's still a large gray part. That's what we're looking for. Yeah. But you see there's a large gray part, which is called sometimes the inevitable catabolism of amino acids, which can range anywhere between, sometimes some people say for lysine, for instance, it can range between 20% and 40%. So what makes up that inevitable catabolism? Can we adjust that? Can we manipulate that? Because that is all the lysine or the methionine that is not deposited, but that contributes to the requirement of the animal. And in the next slide, I show you just a slide of because these things change over time. The animal changes its protein deposition over time, but we typically also change the diet supply over time, but not in the same way as we do as the animal does. And in this slide, you see the change in lysine requirement over time when it is fed a 2-phase feeding program. And the green area that you see on the curve is basically the excess supply of that amino acid. We change the diet just twice, but should we change it 3 times, 4 times, or multiple times? So we have to take into account the different aspects of requirements, and especially with respect to the beyond the building blocks. The gray area is basically the beyond the building blocks, because these animals require these amino acids, but they are eventually lost. They're not deposited.
Yeah, so it's important to adjust these requirements according to time, and so that's complexify a little bit more the story, because we talk about model, we talk about objective, we talk about individual variation, but also in fact on adjusting on during the growth phase, and that is a big issue. Now, I would say, what do we mean when we mean amino acid needs beyond building blocks? Obviously, it's maybe a phrase to challenge you a little bit, but I know that you are interested by also the role of the amino acid as building block, but it's also beyond that. And maybe, Jaap, you can address a little bit more the different role of the amino acids.
Well, the building blocks are, of course, the muscle and the egg and the milk that we're interested in. But amino acids and proteins are involved in many processes. They're involved in functional proteins like enzymes, which are proteins. They are involved in hormones, which are proteins, which are being turned over. The animal needs these, but it has to be renewed quite frequently. There are also defensive proteins like glutathione and mucins, which are essential for the animal to defend itself, to protect itself. They have a tremendous turnover rate, these proteins, and we have to supply them, but eventually they will be lost. So to quantify that's basically a challenge. We can see protein deposition, but can we see defense systems? Can we quantify how much of an amino acid is required to defend an animal?
It's more difficult to qualify.
To quantify, we can qualify it, but can we quantify it?
Quantify it.
And how will the animal respond if we do not provide sufficient amino acids? And what priorities does the animal make? Does it put its defense system at stake or its growth?
It's interesting. So maybe we can ask the representative of the field of the formulation. What does he think about formulating with needs beyond building blocks? So Lane, did you hear the question? So formulating beyond building blocks.
Yeah, for example, regarding immunity, and if you are looking to piglet diets, for example. The reduction of antibiotics is under pressure everywhere in the world. Maybe some countries are a bit ahead, but everybody will follow, I would say. Then the amino acids which are more connected to immunity will be more important, so then you will get another set of requirements for such purposes as well. So for a kind of, let's say, healthy feed for young piglets. But in fact, for older swine, it can also be the case if you know that the circumstances are relatively bad due to the bad climate situation in the houses or whatever, because differences are very big across the world. Then you might need to adjust these levels of these specific amino acids, and that's also what we do.
Thanks, Elaine. So when we think about formulating beyond building blocks, one big part is the intestine, the functioning of the gut, the gut health, and so on. So maybe Mike, you can further comment on that issue on amino acids and the gut functioning.
Absolutely, it's critical, and it's funny that you mentioned the building blocks, because the intestinal health is the first pass critical need of amino acids. So they're gonna start there, and if they need to be met at a higher rate, you won't have any building blocks because everything stays in the intestine.
Yeah.
So the first graphical projection I put up was one of the reviews that Dr. Ed Moran put together, and I can't discuss this area without talking about Dr. Moran and everything that he did over his career to validate amino acid needs for mucus and mucin layers. But the first reference to his work talks about both threonine and glycine, as well as valine and isoleucine, being so critical for the intestinal development and growth. And again, they're highly involved in the mucin, and it's a critical need. Think about the United States right now, and as much as we are moving to antibiotic-free diets in such a rapid rate, we're changing the microflora, and we're also changing amino acid needs to some extent. So in the work that we have done, some of the past work on threonine that I'll reference is two studies, one of which was done, published by myself, and the second with Dr. Corzo being the lead author. And the first we used Cobb, mature broilers, 42 to 56 days. The second we used 708, raw 708 broilers, 42 to 56 days of age, and we were really careful to set these studies up in a controlled environment within one house, but the difference was litter. So we we lined the pins with plastic, and we went out of our way to make sure we had an experimental design where we could solely focus on litter quality. And basically we determined two different responses. As we started this webinar with responses to amino acids, we have two completely different requirement sets, anywhere from 5 to 10% difference on threonine needs, requiring a more higher level in a dirty environment. That's the difference in being a little bit deficient, breaking the bank. So there's huge variation in something like threonine, which is critical. So it points to the importance to know the environmental conditions that you're in before you can set that number, at least cost formulation.
Yeah, thanks. And going further on the mucin aspect, on
sure.
the,
When we look at the metabolism and focus back towards threonine, you can see that two of the deamination pathways are going to glycine and serine as well. So in these two different pathways, we have one, a threonine need for mucin that's going to be higher, but we also have a variation in crude protein because the glycine molecule is going to be represented as a sole entity in uric acid. So we have to take into consideration protein diets as we're lowering them as we move forward, and as well the intestinal environment that we're in. Clearly, Dr. Kuhn and Dr. Baker in the 1970s established the need of glycine. That was further validated by some work that Ben Schutte did in 97, and most recently some of the work that Bill Dozier's student Ruben Caselli is doing is looking at glycine to serine at a total level, and they're showing some very nice responses that we need to put at the front of the research that we're doing in the future.
So more and more we are enlarging the focus not only on the, I would say, fundamental, essential amino acid, but to really all amino acids on the formulations.
Absolutely.
Looking at the effect on the, I would say, building blocks, on the health issues and so on, there is one part which is also interesting, is looking at the effect of amino acids on the meat quality per se. Not only the deposition, but also the meat characteristics. And I interviewed last week Dr. Cécile Berry, head of the Avian Research Unit at INRA in Tours, and address the question on amino acids and meat quality. So let's listen to Cécile. I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Cécile Berry, director of the Avian Research Unit INRA in Tours in France, and to really address some issues regarding the formulation of amino acids beyond their role as building blocks. And the first question I want to ask you, Cécile, is really we look at the effect of transformation of muscle to meat, more on the protein aspects, but it means it is important to consider the energy aspect and the energy transformation during the evolution of muscle to meat. What can you tell a little bit more on that regarding amino acid and energy?
Yes, it's true that the transformation of muscle into meat is greatly related to the amount of glycogen, which means the carbohydrate store in muscle at the moment of death. This will determine the acidification rate and also the acidification extent of the meat. And this parameter will be very determinant for most of the quality parameter of the meat. And this is especially true for the white meat, for example, for the pig or the poultry meat, because it will determine the color, the water holding capacity, the toughness of the meat, and the sensorial quality overall.
You recently demonstrated that you can modify the composition of the muscle and thus the meat by the amino acid supplementation before slaughter. And what is the link between the amino acids and the composition of the muscle, and also on the glycogen reserves?
Yes, the first time we evidence a specific role of amino acid in determining meat quality was about 10 years ago when we supplement in the finishing period broiler with lysine over the need for growth. And we were able to demonstrate for the first time that this will affect not only the breast yield, which was increased, but also the ultimate pH of the meat and, by the way, the water holding capacity. So it was the first time there was a demonstration in poultry that amino acid can affect the quality of the meat. After that, we tried to know a little bit more about the mechanism involved, and we were able to demonstrate that, in fact, the amino acid supply will determine the anabolism, the protein anabolism, but also the ability of chicken, of broiler, to store energy as glycogen in the muscle.
So there is a direct link between the amino acid supply and the glycogen, so the energy reserve of the muscle.
Yes, because in fact the quantity but also the quality of the amino acid will determine the amount of amino acid dedicated to protein synthesis and to the growth of muscle. But it will determine also the amount of carbohydrate stored in the muscle, and therefore this will affect directly the quality of the meat.
And when you talk about that, very often you focus on breast meat. This is typical glycolytic type of muscle and so on. What about the thigh and drumstick, for instance, the red part of the poultry, for instance?
Actually, we only determine the effect of amino acid on the white breast meat, and I have no data on the regulation that occur in the red meat.
But do you think that could be different? Or?
It could be different because I have the feeling that the breast meat and the glycolytic breast muscle is very sensitive, a sensitive muscle. And the glycogen has more effect on the white type of meat than on the red type of meat.
You mentioned, for instance, lysine as an amino acid. What about the key amino acids that could influence the muscle transformation and the meat quality?
Actually, we also showed that which is important is the ratio, for example, between lysine and other essential amino acids. But we also can demonstrate that some kind of amino acid, like sulfur amino acid, can affect other meat quality traits, like, for example, the oxidative sensitivity by increasing or by decreasing the oxidative stress within the muscle.
At the muscle level. Okay.
At the muscle level.
And you demonstrate also recently that a very short-term supplementation, a few days, can influence the meat quality or the meat transformation. How can you elaborate a little bit more on that?
Yes, these results were very interesting because, of course, when we change the amino acid profile and also the supply, the quantity, we also change the growth and the breast and the development of muscle. So the idea was to be able to change the meat quality without changing, without affecting the growth and muscle yield. And we were able to do it by supplying a broiler only 3 days before slaughter. And this result in change and significant change in muscle pH with effect on the color of meat, the toughness, also the processing yield. And this was very interesting because we were able to calculate some improvement in production cost on processed food, for example. And we were able to show that by using a nice regimen, amino acid supply, we can improve greatly the production cost, for example, when we produce ham.
So you think that this dietary strategy, short term, could be a very good possibility, in fact, to improve the quality of the end product?
Yes, it's a good strategy because the cost on the feed is almost null.
Yeah.
But the benefit can be very, very high. And on the contrary, if this final diet is not controlled, the loss, the financial loss can be also very, very high.
Okay.
So
And
it's very interesting for nutritionists
practical,
and for practical use to really well design this the end of the nutrition, the final part of the nutrition, few days before slaughter.
obviously, this applied to poultry with a very rapid growth rate. And do you think that could be applied also in swine or eventually in beef?
Maybe yes, maybe especially in swine, where the type of meat is very close to that of broiler, and I think the swine muscles from swine can be also sensitive to this supply, but it has to be tested.
Okay, thank you very much, Cécile. So quite an interesting view on the effect of amino acids on meat quality. And I would say when we are dealing with amino acids, we are dealing also with a balance of amino acids and between the interaction with amino acids. So maybe, Jaap, you can further comment about the interaction between the amino acids.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a very important issue that has been didn't get the attention that it deserves so far. We've been looking a lot to individual amino acids, but a few years ago we looked at valine requirements in relation to the leucine supply. And in the slide that you see now is you see two dose response studies, titration studies to the valine supply in terms of in pigs, and you see daily gain. And one was done with 113 leucine to lysine ratio on an SID basis, and one was with a much higher leucine supply of 165. And what you can see is that basically it doesn't change the requirement that much. The requirement is around 74, 75 based on this model. What you do see is that the response below if you supply valine below the requirement, the response with an excess leucine is quite high, very high. And the reason because of these interactions among the branched-chain amino acids is that they are catabolized by enzyme complexes that are common for all three branched-chain amino acids, so valine, isoleucine, and leucine. The first step is reversible, but the second step is irreversible, meaning that an excess supply of one of these three amino acids can also provoke the catabolism of the other ones. So that is something that we know, but we have not been able to, or so far we have not quantified how the relationships should be, how to quantify these relationships among amino acids. And I think that's an important area for the future.
So really balancing the amino acids and looking at the interaction. Maybe, Mike, you want to add some comments on the branched chain amino acids?
Sure, especially with the branched chain, we have a commonality in the structure, and we are trying to reduce protein in certain environments, and we do so. We tend to have higher cereal-based diets and lower oilseed-based diets, and especially with corn, we can have higher levels of leucine. I'll point to a couple of studies that were done about a decade ago. Dave Burnham's work with Rob Gauss during his thesis, and Jared Kersey's work with Park Walter during his thesis. They both looked at very practical approaches on branched-chain amino acid interactions, and they showed with higher-based cereals, primarily reducing the levels of valine and isoleucine to leucine as leucine was increasing in the diet. When they kept the diets practical, they did not see too much of an effect on performance. So indicating the interaction is going to occur, but it's going to occur in a more academic or scientific scenario than that in practice. But I put the graph here with regard to metabolism just to point reference to the transaminase for all three branched-chain amino acids, because I want to go back to intestinal needs and mucin and the importance of this and antibiotic-free programs, and the fact that these amino acids are going to be utilized first. So with the branched-chain amino acids, their catabolism is going to glutamine, and not only is it a functional component of mucin, it's also key in the energy metabolism of enterocytes. So when we think about these branched-chain amino acids and some of the interplay and interactions, I think we also need to think about the environment.
It's really challenging the nutritionist to reconsider the whole arrangement between amino acid and interactions. But one topic we mentioned in the introduction was on the reduction of the dietary protein concentration. It's quite an issue worldwide, I would say. And maybe Mike, you have more idea about that. I know that the swine have maybe ahead a little bit, but I think it's a big issue also in poultry and to reduce the dietary protein concentration.
I think that's a good way to put it. I'm here with the swine nutritionists, and I think they're a lot better than we are. But we have a lot to learn in poultry. We've been working hard over the years and trying to reduce protein, and with each feed-grade amino acid that we're implementing, we have a subsequent decrease in protein, and the work that I've showed here in this graph is something that I started back in the mid-90s with Dr. Brian Kerr, and he and I would look at different protein diet. We created a meta-analysis of data around the world, and we looked at protein and the reductions of nitrogen per se with the effect of protein, and we found that each incremental decrease from adding feed-grade amino acids, say from 21% to 20 or 20 to 19, we had between a 7 and an 8% reduction of nitrogen. So huge benefits for the environment.
Benefits, yeah.
And we just need to determine, because as we lower dietary protein, we're focusing on the first few essential amino acids, and the ones that we call less limiting are now coming more limiting, and we just don't know enough about them to keep going down. So it's something we're continuing to learn on. And with that said, I want to make mention to a publication that Leandro Hackenhar put together, and we did this because there was a lot of controversy as to, okay, fourth limiting amino acid, how do we go to the next step? Because this is the point where L-threonine had gone from an opportunity ingredient to a staple and least cost formulation for broiler rations across the world. And then the question was, well, how do we lower protein more? Well, you go to the fourth limiting amino acid and you optimize that. And we did least cost formulation runs in the diet with corn and soybean, wheat and soybean, sorghum and soybean, fixed amino acid ratios. Long story short, primarily branch change. So valine was fourth limiting in the vegetable-based diets, whereas isoleucine was most limiting in the diets with meat meals. So it's a point where those two amino acids specifically need to be focused on in order to be able to reduce protein going forward. We have the ideal protein concept that we use and that we focus on, and it was established again with the excellent swine nutritionist, but we use it and we focus on it. If we look at the interplay between valine and isoleucine, I think there's some room to fine-tune those responses and the levels we need so we can keep reducing protein, and we probably need to get glycine in the equation as much research is starting to focus on looking at glycine and serine as digestible lysine to total glycine serine. Dr. Dozier's doing most of that work. It's really a nice way to look at it. So we've got to fine-tune these to be able to go to the next level.
It's interesting, and maybe we can challenge the formulator to see how he looks at reducing dietary protein content. And I'm sure that in Europe it's a big issue, but we can ask Lane from Cargill, in fact, what does it mean for him, the reduction of dietary protein content?
Yeah, sure. I'm based in the Netherlands, and I think in the Netherlands it all started. I remember that more than 25 years ago, we already did some trials to find the lowest protein levels for grower and finisher feed for swine. And it's still relevant, and you get more pressure also in countries like Germany, like Denmark, like Belgium, as well on protein as on phosphor. And then, of course, it's a challenge, which is the next limiting amino acids, and also what I just mentioned, how does the dose response curve look like? Yeah. Because it might be for certain amino acid that the optimal performance is that you need a ratio of 60% for whatever amino acid, but that if you apply 55%, you only have a very small reduction in performance, but a very strong reduction in cost. Because especially if you need to reduce that by including less ingredients, if you have all synthetic amino acids available, okay, you can judge because you know the cost of the synthetic amino acids. It's relatively easy. But if for the amino acids which are not available synthetic, you need to reduce the soya, the rapeseed meal, and so on. The cost will be very high, or it will limit the reduction by a big part. So that's also for new amino acids like isoleucine, for example, that for higher volumes of production, it will be very important that if suppliers can produce it, what will cost be, so that a close cooperation, I would always say, to investigate to produce such amino acids between the feed industry and such suppliers is extremely important to judge how relevant is such an amino acid and how much will it be used and at what cost.
It's interesting, and if I could add another question, Lane, about the taking into account the environmental conditions, because you talk about you are formulating for a lot of countries around the world. So I think it's important also to look at what would be the effect of the extreme conditions and so on these formulation objectives and requirements.
Environmental conditions, high temperature, extremely high temperature, that the whole density of the feed is changing, then the amino acid profile. Maybe the level, but the profile itself may be less, because in such circumstances, in many cases, whole birds are produced instead of breast meat. So less profile, but more density of the feed, and maybe adjusting the level of lysine, but with a fixed ratio of the other amino acids. But indeed, formulas are not copy-paste from the Netherlands to if it is Sudan with extreme temperatures or such type of countries.
Okay, thank you. When thinking about the benefits of dietary amino acids, we always consider the technical aspects. Sometimes we forget the return on investment, and I'm sure Lane has already addressed a little bit that question. Mike, what about the objective if you talk about benefits, economical benefits?
Well, I think that's the formation of where the response comes into play, because we've talked a number of different segments throughout this webinar about so-called requirements and responses and amino acid needs, but clearly you have one chance to put one number in, and that's got to be an economic optimum. So the response that I put up kind of shows that in a perfect world you can do a dose response and get a amino acid need in a given situation, but based on the output, based on the economics, what is going to be the economic optimum. And in this scenario, there's presented digestible valine, isoleucine, and arginine, because I did this for a reason. Because if we take an amino acid like lysine, and we know where the response should be, if we decrease that response in a minimum in formulation, say 5%, we're probably going to get a substantial decrease in feed conversion and meat yield from that response. But if we decrease a less limiting amino acid, 5%, we'll see it immediately in terms of diet cost, but will we see it in terms of performance? So with the economic optimum in play, there's a lot we need to do to balance the diet for performance based on the conditions of the integrator.
I'm sure that Lane will also complement on what you said, because I think they are facing the issue about what is the return on investment, putting more of an amino acid regarding the objectives. I would like also to add a question to Lane, not only the benefit-cost ratio, but also, do we need more information to better formulate on amino acids?
No, I think that information about the curves of the dose response, more information would be welcome. And I can imagine that producers of amino acids like to show where you will receive the maximum performance and maybe not the optimal or the optimal economical performance, because then you sell less synthetic amino acids, but I think it is important to get the highest profit for integrators, for farmers, for feed mills, to know that information, because it's almost always plateauing at a certain moment, that there's still some response, but what is communicated about it, and if that information is only coming from universities and so on, there's much more information available in the market. A closer cooperation between the two would be more than welcome, because at the end, optimization is always, you have the input of the ingredients, of the nutrients, and the prices. And the part of the prices in many research is not or hardly taken into account, but I think in most cases not taken into account, and it drives the formula at the end.
Quite interesting. Maybe, you told me that you wanted to give some comments on that.
Yeah, I agree with him, with Elaine. Of course, in research, we're looking at biology, we're looking at biological responses. And they will change, of course, especially in poultry. They have changed tremendously. What changes very rapidly is prices. And of course, we can, as a scientist, if we set up an experimental program and it takes a year or two to do it, and another year to get it published, prices are completely out of the range. So I think it's important to combine two. We can provide a biological response, but the economic context is changing every day. So it's important to re-optimize based on the biological response of the animal.
Absolutely.
Good point. So I'm sure that that stimulates the questions on the platform. Maybe we can now stop on the presentation, and the time is really flying. So sorry for the participants. So we will start to ask a few questions just now, and for the question we will not ask. In fact, feel free, to send your question on the web platform, and we will answer to the question with our experts later on. So one of the first questions is, what's the difference between synthetic amino acids and amino acid present in the ingredients? And that's, I would say, typically for the formulator, but I would prefer maybe to ask Jaap and Mike to answer to that question.
Well, in pig nutrition, that's a question that was asked many years ago when Batterham did the study where he showed that, free amino acids, synthetic amino acids are readily absorbable, and so they are immediately available to the animal, whereas perhaps the protein source, the energy sources or the other protein sources are not available. Many studies have been done ever since, and we have never really seen an effect, for instance, of feeding frequency on amino acid use. So in terms of metabolic, what the animal sees once it is absorbed is amino acids, peptides, but that's it. So a potential difference would be in the gut. And does the gut have receptors for amino acids or for proteins? And perhaps there is a response in that, but in practical feeding, I have not seen any difference in terms of free amino acid use compared to
even
protein.
when you compare, I would say, swine with meal feeding, and I would say broilers with more nibbler and eating the whole day and so on.
Yeah, and I won't go into detail with the work by Batterham because he explained that very, very well. But we have a meal-fed bird, and we've wondered the same thing in our conceptual idea of amino acid absorption. But what I would like to point to is the difference is we're looking at an individual amino acid versus a pool of amino acids. So as we feed, for example, high amino acid density diets for birds for an economic optimum in a certain scenario, we're moving the whole plane of nutrition forward. And when we do that with feed-grade amino acids, we're doing that with certain amino acids, and we're creating limitations in others. So that's another concept I think we need to be very, very keen to remember.
So sure, we can, I would say, debate a little bit more on that. So maybe we can take another question. Even if the time is flying, I think we have some time to answer to some questions. So an interesting question regarding the objectives. We always talk about breast meat. Do we consider that amino acid needs for the development of breast is the same for thigh and drumsticks?
You want to do the broiler one?
Maybe broiler for the
for pigs it will be more difficult.
So we look at the deboning typically of all the parts in the trials we do, and some of this was presented earlier this year at the Australian Poultry Science Symposium in Sydney. And with low protein diets, if we miss it, and typically, not typically, but many of the time do miss it in formulation to get the response to where it needs to be, we have a reduction in breast meat yield. So by default, based on a yield-based parts percentage, with lower protein diets or with amino acid balance that's not geared toward optimizing white meat yield, because that's what the bird wants to do, you can maintain a feed conversion and increase dark meat yields at the same time. That's pretty clear.
But so you would recommend slightly different, I would say, amino acid profile
Absolutely.
in Asia Pacific when they are concerned by more the rest of the carcass or the whole carcass, and the
you need to feed for feed conversion there because pushing the bird more for white meat yield, they probably don't want to push the bird more, but they're probably pushing feed conversion. But you don't need to push the bird in those environments to get the carcass percentage of dark meat yield, because that's going to be where the lower percentage of breast comes into play.
So that could be really interesting to reconsider that. Maybe a last question. It's based on the Cécile interview. As for meat quality, could we think about short-term amino acid supplementation for specific needs? You talk about gut health, you talk about different aspects beyond, I would say, meat quality. Have we considered, for instance, an extra supplementation of amino acids to solve a sanitary issue, to solve some gut functioning and so on?
Not that I know of. The first point that comes to my mind when you mention meat quality is looking at the withdrawal time in commercial broilers, potentially putting something in the water. We've got to remember the rapid turnover of amino acids. A pool of amino acids, 48 to 72 hours, but we have experimented, for example, with tryptophan back in the 90s with Dr. Moran, looking at feeding or providing tryptophan in the water before slaughter to relax the birds in that particular environment. So I think we could also consider looking at amino acid supply prior to these situations for meat quality as well. And I don't want to get into something like myopathies, because I think that's identified long before the end of the trial, but for sure that would just be one example.
And next year, because you will be talking at our advanced year next year, so on hot conditions or environmental conditions would be quite another challenge on the amino acid requirements.
Yes.
I think time is really flying, so I'm sorry for the people who ask questions. So don't forget that you can still drop your questions on the web platform, and we'll answer to the question with our specialists. As a joke, I would say I would like to ask a question to our two invitees. For years and years, we think about the ideal protein based on the lysine, because it started on swine and so on, and it's an essential amino acid for swine. But in broilers or poultry, I would say the most essential one is methionine. Why not to have ideal protein based on lysine for swine and methionine for broilers?
Oh, and who
wants to comment on that?
He puts that to the poultry guy again.
Yeah. No, well, I mean. For lysine, for instance, we don't think just in terms of lysine, we think in terms of lysine relative to net energy or metabolizable energy.
Yeah.
And we have to have a reference because lysine to net energy ratios change over the lifespan of an animal. And people have some idea about how it changes. Threonine to net energy will change the same way. Tryptophan to net energy will also change. So rather than having an image, how does amino acid relative to energy change? It's good to have a reference, and lysine is a relatively stable reference. And then think of, well, how does threonine to lysine? What should the ratio be? Even though people sometimes think that threonine to lysine may change because the contribution of maintenance may change. So, is it important to change the reference? And should we have a reference? I think yes, because it makes life for the nutritionist much simpler.
The question is really, in fact, to see if there is no bias when we consider poultry, for instance, compared to.
Would it make a difference if you would use methionine as a reference? I'm not sure.
Mike.
Well, yeah, we have a feather situation. I'm not sure we're going to know how to get around. Clearly, but with poultry, the same concept is true with the swine, and that is that lysine is highly limiting, and the whole body protein accretion is at a high rate versus maintenance is almost zero. So we have that same situation, even though lysine is not first limiting in poultry, but we need a reference, and these amino acids are interplaying. Threonine and methionine are interplaying when we look at the intestinal interaction type environments. So we need a reference. Is it the best one?
Yeah. As we said at the beginning, we need a reference. We need a common base.
Yeah.
So it may be the best situation.
But clearly, we have more to learn. So that question may be answered soon. Who knows?
Okay, thank you very much. So I would like to warmly thank our today speakers, so Dr. Jaap van Milgen from Rennes, and the Professor Mike Kidd from Arkansas, and also Lane from Cargill in Rotterdam. And I would say you will have the answer on all your questions on the web platform. You will be able to listen to the program again on the podcast and so on. You can. It will be divided in sections because already this time it's a bit long compared to the previous one, but you will have the possibility to look at the whole live webinar as well as different parts of the webinar. We hope you enjoy the webinar, and you will continue to be addicted to the FeedChannel.online platform. We give you appointment for the next FeedChannel live webinar in February, mid-February, and it will be devoted to egg quality. And the next one in April, we'll go back to swine. I will give more information later on. So I would say bye-bye, everyone, and looking forward to seeing you next February. And because it's a final closing of the last webinar of 2017, I think I would like to, on behalf of Adiseo and the whole team on FeedChannel, to wish you Merry Christmas and Happy New Year. Thanks very much. Bye.